This is sort of a companion video to my world-breaking series, and it's also a sequel to my Rule of Cool video. Although really, I just want to clarify something that I sort of took for granted, but realized that I should probably say out loud. Because a lot of videos I've made dance around the points that I am going to make in this video. See, there's a common piece of advice that DMs should not say no to their players. And this advice is insane. Now, unlike a lot of insane advice out there in D&D, its heart is totally in the right place. Because there are two really good reasons to never say no. The first, which is the one that I hear the most often, but I also think is the least useful, is that because D&D is so much like long-form improv, the rule of yes and should apply to D&D as well. For those unfamiliar, the yes and rule basically means keep an improv scene moving forward by not contradicting something that your scene partner says. Work with what you're given rather than pushing back against it or ignoring it. That will lead to the most satisfying results. And I do think there is some truth to this, and at some point I am going to make a video about what yes and actually means and how it can be applied to D&D, both in how you as a DM can yes and your players, and in how players can yes and their DM's story. But I do think the importance of this rule has kind of been overinflated in recent years. And in part that's because the most visible examples of this game that we can all share with each other are clips or episodes of actual play shows. And clearly, I love actual play shows and I spend a lot of time thinking about them. But the fact that so many of the most successful actual play shows are staffed with players who have spent years of their lives in the entertainment industry in some form or another, well, that's led to the improv yes and advice being repeated by players and DMs because that's how they personally learned to be good, successful players. It's gotten to the point where you should take some improv classes is a really common piece of D&D advice, and that was not the case 7 or 8 years ago. And I'm not going to say that you can't find any value if you do that, I'm just saying that is just one approach to the game, and it is not necessary for everyone to do that in order to have a successful, productive, thriving game. But that's not the only reason to never say no, and the other reason, I think, is a lot better. The other argument to not saying no to your players is because they're your friends. And this is actually the argument that I have made in the past, and I'm going to make it again in the future. I literally just made this point a couple of days ago when I was discussing whether or not you should ban classes in your D&D games. If you have a choice between making an exception so your friends will keep hanging out with you, or sticking to your guns and not playing with your friends, I personally recommend you make an exception. Otherwise, your group could fracture into pieces like the Protestants. It's okay if that didn't mean anything to you, that joke was just for me. But honestly, I don't think there's anything in D&D that you can realistically always do, or never do. Though there will definitely be videos that I will make or have made where I say always or never, you can realistically assume that yes, exceptions do and can and will happen. And in this specific case, I really hesitate to say, never say no. First, obviously we all know that there is the potential for behavior at a D&D game that is not acceptable, because it is disruptive or any number of other reasons. And the ability for you to say, no, stop it, is invaluable. Realistically, the people offering the never say no advice are not talking about when a player crosses a line. But realistically, when you're trying to take advice like honor your players' choices and acknowledge their contributions, and it gets boiled down over time and repetition to always say yes, which then becomes never say no, there's some mistranslation happening there. Because really and truly, I think that's what we're talking about. The reason never say no, always say yes, is a commonly shared piece of advice is this. You want to make sure your players are empowered to make choices. The reason we as DMs encourage you to say yes to your players is because, in general, players are skittish, gentle creatures. It may not seem that way when they're burning down your towns or torturing your quest givers, but it's true. Players are risk averse. They want to do things that they are reasonably sure they're going to succeed at. They want as many guarantees as they can get. And they'll learn very quickly that if there's a behavior that you've shut down, they shouldn't try to do it again. And that often is not our goal when we do that. Let's say that your players enter a temple deep beneath the earth, and some snake cultists attack them. And your players try to defuse the situation, explaining that they are not here to fight. But you know that these cultists are not human anymore. They're not even mindless animals. They are drones to this other evil force. Their minds have been infected by something that has stripped away all the capacity for reason, thought, and emotion. Everything is gone except for a basic need to hurt anyone who enters the temple. Because in part, when you were writing this adventure, it never actually occurred to you that the players would want to talk to the cultists and try to talk them down. And now your entire adventure is structured around the idea that these cultists are irredeemably, unreasonably evil. Literally, reasoning with them will not work, because if it does, your entire story falls apart. This, by the way, is a true story from one of my games. My players kept asking me, can we try to reason with them? And like a dummy, I kept letting them roll. And then they would roll, and regardless of what the result was, I would say, no, they're not listening to you, they just keep attacking. So they kept trying because they thought they just were not rolling high enough. Somebody rolled a natural 20, and I had to look her dead in the eyes and say, there's nothing you can do to convince them. Their minds are too far gone. There are story reasons why they cannot react rationally. But I should have never let them roll. If they were trying to talk down a zombie horde, I wouldn't have let them roll. I just would have said, there's nothing left for you to reason with. There is nothing human left in their minds. And I absolutely should have done the same thing with the snake cultists. There may be dozens of examples across your campaigns when a player will ask you for something and you have to answer no, for any number of reasons. It might be in regards to character creation, or an option they want to take when they level up, or an action they want to do in combat, or the way a spell works. And assuming that saying no does not shut down the fun at the table, and I've made a whole other video about that, you should be allowed to tell people no. There are times when what they're asking for is all the player wants, and there's no harm in making an exception and saying yes. And that's what I try to encourage whenever I can. But sometimes that's not possible, and saying no really is the best option for everyone at the table, including that player, whether or not they believe that. My players in the Snake Temple were way more disappointed by the fact that their efforts to convince the cultists to stop attacking them were failing. Far more disappointed than if I had just said, these are mindless drones, you can tell that very clearly, there's nothing you can roll that will convince them. After that fight, I realized that my players wanted more rational villains that they could try to negotiate with and understand. They wanted villains that they could engage with, so I started adding more into the campaign. But my players had learned the opposite lesson. They had internalized the idea that trying to communicate with villains doesn't work, which of course sucked, because they were not playing the game the way they wanted to play. They were playing the game the way they thought I wanted them to play. Okay, so we've covered the idea of saying no, but what about the second half of this video title? How do you say no without saying no? Because again, your players are skittish. If you just say no, it could spook them into making some poor decisions, or into changing their approach to the game in a way that hurts their fun. So the simplest option is to always, or whenever possible, offer an alternative. When my players were trying to talk down the snake cultists, I should not have said, yes, you can try, go ahead and roll for persuasion. But instead of just saying, no, move on with your turn, I should have said, make an insight check. That still keeps the power in their hands like they wanted, but it doesn't put them in a scenario where they're rolling something that I already know can't have an impact. Then, maybe regardless of what they rolled, I would give them something. On a low roll, I might say something like, the cultist ignores you. It's almost like he doesn't hear you, even though you know that he's responding to the sounds you're making as you're moving around in this tunnel. On a mid-range roll, I might say something like, the cultists all adjust their grip on their weapons at the exact same time in the exact same way. They all lock eyes with members of your party, and they all snarl in unison. And then I would leave it to the players to draw their own conclusions based on that information. And then on a high roll, I might say something like, their eyes flicker with a moment of realization, of understanding, but then his eyes glow with a bit of faint magic, and that recognition fades away, and all that's left is a snarling maniac whose movements do not seem to be under his own control. Offering alternatives, I have found, is the most successful way to tell your players, no, that's not going to fly, without making it seem like the idea they had was bad and dumb. It helps you seem like the good cop, trying to work with them to make sure their goals can happen, rather than the bad cop just shutting down the discussion, or leaving them to try something that is ultimately going to fail no matter what. If I can potentially make an exception, then I will usually ask them what appeals to them about the idea they're trying to execute on, and then make a judgment call, like I discussed in my first world-breaking video. But when I know that an exception can't work, and I usually have a pretty good sense of that these days, you just get better at that with time and as you figure out your style. But when I know an exception can't work, I just jump in and start offering alternatives. Somebody wants to roll an Arcana check about a name they just heard to see if they might recognize it from one of the magical books that they've read. But I know that there are no magic books about this figure for, like, plot and lore reasons. So I offer alternatives. You can roll a religion check or a history check to see if you might recognize this name from a footnote. I actually never really have to worry about this during combat because we all know that there is a system in place. That does all the work for me. I don't need to ever be the bad cop when there is an existing rule set, which empowers me just to figure out how to allow them to do the cool stuff they want to do. And I did a whole video about that, you can check it out here. But if we're in combat, or any other part of the game where there is a very clear system doing the work, and they suggest something that doesn't line up with the mechanics, I have no problem just saying, no, that's not how it works, when I know that there's not an alternative or the opportunity for an exception. So the next time you're in a situation at your table where a player asks to do something that you know isn't going to work, that there's no role or situation where you can give them what they want, do your best to pivot them to something that they can do. We want to reward players who engage with the game and with your world, but we also have to work really hard to preserve the game's tone and style and keep the world internally consistent. And the players don't have all the same information that you do. They don't know that what they asked is impossible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked. And I find that the best way to handle it is to offer them the best path forward, one that will get them the closest to their goal, because that helps to steer them away from the specific course of action that won't or couldn't or shouldn't work without grinding the entire game to a halt. Now, sometimes you might say no because you don't know how to proceed. You don't know how to narrate or adjudicate whatever it is that they want to do. But you know who could help with that? Our sponsor, Describe. They have more than 7,000 scenes to help you describe locations, monsters, NPCs, magic items, and dialogue, and you can read these scenes aloud at your table like any box text from an adventure. You know, they have a category on their website where you can find all of the scenes for each of the different planes of reality. That actually has nothing to do with the subject of today's video, but I just think that's rad. If you're running a campaign like Journeys from the Radiant Citadel, then you might want to bookmark some of these, like Short Travel Across the Ethereal Plane. Or if you're getting ready for a Spelljammer campaign, maybe you're going to need Arrival to the Astral Plane. You can get these scenes and so many more by visiting describe.com/supergeek, and you can use the code SUPERGEEK to save 10% off of your first subscription payment. That's dscryb.com/supergeek. Thank you so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. And thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, and you want to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. You can subscribe or ring the bell to get these videos as soon as they come out, which is every Monday and Thursday. You can join my Patreon. If you join at $3 a month, you get some cool, exclusive D&D content that I make for the patrons. You can join my Discord and be a part of an ongoing discussion in between these videos. We talk about our campaigns, and homebrew, and actual play, and all kinds of cool stuff. And you can sign up for my newsletter to get updates about whatever I've got going on. The links for all those are in the doobly-doo below. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.